To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Kitchen. Gary Sexton had always been a man of two faces. To the world, he was Staff Sergeant Gary Sexton, head chef of the Marine Expeditionary Force stationed in Ramadi, Iraq. His fellow Marines knew him as the guy who could turn military rations into something resembling actual food, the quiet soldier who kept to himself but always had your back in a firefight. What they didn't know was that Gary Sexton didn't exist. The man behind the name was Claude George, though even that identity had been buried so deep that sometimes he forgot it himself. For the past 8 years, he'd been the Marine Corps' most classified asset, a Black Ops specialist whose official records listed him as Kia in Afghanistan. The cooking was real. It had been his cover story for so long that he'd actually become skilled at it. But his real job was elimination, surgical, precise, and completely off the books. Gary had met Helen Merritt at a military family support event 3 years ago, during a brief stateside rotation. She was working as a victim's advocate for the county sheriff's office, helping military families navigate crises. She had auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire, and a smile that made him believe, for the first time in his adult life, that he could be someone other than a weapon. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Helen seemed enchanted by his quiet intensity, the way he listened more than he spoke, how he could fix anything with his hands. She never pressed when he couldn't talk about his deployments, accepting his explanation that he worked in food service logistics. When they married after 6 months, Gary thought he'd finally found his way home. Nathan came along a year later, a beautiful boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's quick smile. Gary had never known love like this existed. When he held his son, the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled completely. For the first time since he was 17 years old, Gary Sexton wanted to live, not just survive. The house they bought in Pine Ridge was modest but perfect, a craftsman-style home on 3 acres outside town, far enough from neighbors that Gary could practice his real skills in the converted barn without questions. Helen thought he was just a fitness enthusiast who liked woodworking. She had no idea that the workshop contained enough weapons to arm a small militia, or that her husband could kill a man 17 different ways with just his bare hands. Gary's current deployment was supposed to be his last. He'd been laying groundwork for months to transition out of Black Ops entirely. The brass wasn't happy about losing their best asset, but they couldn't force a ghost to stay dead forever. He planned to come home, maybe open a restaurant, and be the father and husband his family deserved. All of that changed on a Tuesday in October, when Sheriff Vernon Jensen sent him a video that shattered his world. Chapter 2. The video that changed everything. The message came through encrypted channels at 0200 local time. Gary was reviewing intelligence reports in his quarters when his secure phone buzzed with an incoming transmission. The sender was listed as V. Jensen, someone Gary had never heard of. His first instinct was to delete it, but something made him open it instead. The video file was 47 seconds long. Gary watched it 3 times before the full horror of what he was seeing sank in. Nathan, his 6-year-old son, was tied to a chair in what looked like the basement of their home. The boy's face was streaked with tears, his small body trembling with terror. Behind him stood Helen, but this wasn't the woman Gary had married. This Helen wore a cold smile that never reached her eyes, her hand resting possessively on Nathan's shoulder. "Tell Daddy goodbye," Helen said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Your son's crying for you. Too bad you'll never see him again." Nathan's voice broke as he sobbed into the camera. "Help me, Dad. Please come home. I'm scared." The camera shifted, revealing a man Gary didn't recognize, tall, thin, with the kind of cruel eyes Gary had seen in his other life. The man stepped into frame, putting his arm around Helen's waist with obvious familiarity. "Daddy can't help you now, boy," the man said. "He's got more important things to do than take care of his family." Helen leaned down and kissed Nathan's forehead, but there was no motherly affection in the gesture. It was mockery, pure and simple. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Uncle Jack and I will take very good care of you." The video ended, but Gary's phone immediately buzzed with a text message from the same number. "Stay where you are, or he won't see the next sunrise. We know what you really do, Claude. Try anything, and the boy dies. Sheriff V. Jensen." Gary stared at the screen, his mind reeling. They knew. Somehow, they knew who he really was. His hands didn't shake as he set the phone down. His breathing remained steady. Years of training had taught him to compartmentalize, to think clearly even when the world was ending. But inside, something fundamental was breaking apart and reshaping itself into something harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. Gary began to plan. Chapter 3, The Awakening. Gary's first call went to Colonel Ross Downey, his handler at Marine Special Operations Command. Downey picked up on the first ring, despite the late hour. "We have a problem," Gary said without preamble. "My cover's been blown. My family's been taken." There was a long pause. "Explain." Gary sent the video file through secured channels and waited while Downey reviewed it. When the colonel came back on the line, his voice was grim. "Christ, Gary. How the hell did a small-town sheriff get access to your real identity? That's what we're going to find out. I need extraction. Tonight." "Negative. You're 6 months out from rotation. If you disappear now, it'll raise flags with too many people." "Colonel, they have my son. I understand that. But if you blow your cover now, it won't just compromise you. It'll expose 17 ongoing operations across 3 theaters. I'm sorry, Gary, but you're going to have to handle this through official channels." Gary closed his eyes. He'd expected this response, but it still felt like a betrayal. Official channels involve the FBI, local law enforcement, any of whom could be compromised. "My son will be dead before the first agent sets foot in Pine Ridge. There has to be another way." "There is." Gary's voice became perfectly calm, perfectly level. "I finished this mission, submit my after-action report, and request immediate rotation due to a family emergency. That gives me 2 weeks to get home without raising suspicions." 2 weeks might be too long. "No," Gary said. And for the first time, Colonel Downey heard something in his operative's voice that made him glad they were separated by several thousand miles. 2 weeks is perfect. It's exactly how long I need to prepare." Over the next 13 days, Gary Sexton ceased to exist in all but the most superficial ways. The man who remained was Claude George, and Claude George was something much more dangerous than a Marine cook with anger management issues. He used his access to military intelligence networks to build detailed profiles of everyone involved. Sheriff Vernon Jensen had been in office for 12 years, with a reputation for being tough but fair. On the surface, he was a model public servant. But Gary's dig went deeper than the surface. Jensen's financial records showed several unexplained deposits over the past 2 years, always in cash, always just under the reporting threshold. More interesting was the timing. The deposits coincided with drug busts that yielded surprisingly small amounts of contraband. Gary suspected Jensen was skimming from seizures, but that wasn't what interested him most. What interested him was Jack Durham. Durham was Jensen's nephew, a man with a thin criminal record and no visible means of support who somehow managed to maintain an expensive lifestyle. More importantly, Durham had been sniffing around Helen for months before Gary's deployment. The affair had been going on for at least 6 months, possibly longer. But the real revelation came when Gary hacked into Helen's phone records and social media accounts. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd trusted with his heart and his son's life, had been planning this for over a year. She knew about his real identity, had known before they were even married. The victim's advocate job wasn't coincidence. Helen had been recruited specifically to target Gary, to build a relationship with someone the government desperately wanted to keep off the books. The marriage, Nathan's birth, the house in Pine Ridge, all of it had been an elaborate honey trap designed to control him. Gary sat in his quarters on the 13th night, reading through the evidence he'd compiled. Outside, the desert wind howled through the base like the voice of something ancient and vengeful. He felt oddly calm, the way he always did before a mission. His phone buzzed with another video. This one showed Nathan in what looked like a cage, barely conscious, clearly drugged. Helen and Jack stood nearby, arguing about something Gary couldn't hear. The accompanying text was brief. 2 days left, Claude. Don't make us wait. Gary smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. They thought they were hunting him, but they'd made a fundamental error. They'd mistaken the predator for the prey. He sent his final mission report to Colonel Downey and submitted his rotation request. By the time his commanding officer read it, Gary was already gone, slipping out of the base like a shadow at midnight. The ghost was coming home, and he was bringing hell with him. Chapter 4, Homecoming. Gary's plane touched down at Denver International at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in late October. He'd spent the flight transforming himself back into someone who could move through the civilian world without attracting attention. Gone was the military bearing, the careful composure. In its place was a man consumed by worry for his family. Exactly what anyone would expect from a soldier rushing home to a crisis. His first stop wasn't Pine Ridge. Instead, he drove 6 hours south to a storage facility outside Santa Fe, where Claude George maintained one of several emergency caches. The unit looked like any other, filled with boxes of seasonal decorations and old furniture. But hidden beneath the false floor was enough equipment to outfit a small mercenary unit. Gary selected his tools carefully. The Sig Sauer P226 with custom suppressor. Tactical gear that could pass for hunting equipment. A laptop with military-grade encryption and hacking software. Most importantly, a small device that looked like a smartphone but was actually a military-grade surveillance system capable of tapping into any electronic device within a quarter-mile radius. The drive to Pine Ridge took another 4 hours. Gary arrived just after dawn, parking his rental car at a truck stop 3 miles outside town. From there, he disappeared into the wilderness that surrounded his property. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. Helen's car was in the driveway, along with a pickup truck Gary didn't recognize, probably Jack Durham's. Gary spent the morning conducting surveillance from the tree line, using binoculars to map the interior movement patterns. What he saw made his blood run cold. Helen moved through the house like a woman without a care in the world. She was cooking breakfast, humming to herself, occasionally laughing at something Jack said from the living room. There was no sign of Nathan anywhere. Gary moved closer, using skills learned in a dozen different war zones to infiltrate his own property. The surveillance device picked up their conversation through the kitchen window. "Should have killed the kid weeks ago," Jack was saying. "He's becoming a liability." "We need him alive until Claude gets here," Helen replied. "He won't come if he thinks Nathan's already dead." "And after? What's to stop him from turning us in?" Helen's laugh was cold. "He won't be in any condition to turn anyone in. Your uncle's plan is perfect. Make it look like Claude snapped, killed his family in a PTSD episode, then turn the gun on himself. The military will bury the whole thing to avoid embarrassment." Gary felt something freeze inside his chest. This wasn't just about money or revenge. This was about covering up something much bigger. He activated the device's recording function and settled in to wait. Over the next 6 hours, he listened to Helen and Jack discuss details that made the scope of the betrayal clear. Jensen wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was running a sophisticated operation that used military families as leverage against service members in sensitive positions. Gary wasn't their first target. Over the past 3 years, they'd compromised at least 6 other soldiers, forcing them to provide intelligence, facilitate drug shipments, or simply disappear when their usefulness ended. The operation was bigger than Pine Ridge, bigger than Colorado. It reached into military bases across the country. But Gary was their crown jewel. His access to classified operations made him invaluable. The plan was to keep him under control indefinitely, using Nathan as leverage. If that failed, they'd eliminate all witnesses and move on to the next target. As the sun set, Gary heard something that changed everything. Nathan was alive, but he wasn't in the house. He was being held in an abandoned mine shaft 20 miles east of town, the same mine where they disposed of other problems over the years. Gary smiled in the darkness. They'd just told him exactly where to find his son. More importantly, they'd told him exactly how many people needed to die. Chapter 5, The Hunt Begins. Gary spent 3 days conducting reconnaissance on the mine shaft. The location was perfect for their purposes, isolated, accessible only by a single dirt road, and surrounded by terrain that would swallow any evidence they wanted to disappear. The mine itself was a relic from the 1940s, officially abandoned, but clearly being used for more than storage. Gary counted 4 guards in rotation, all armed, all with the casual professionalism of men who'd done this before. Security cameras covered the approaches, and the entrance was secured with military-grade locks. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They were guarding against law enforcement and civilian threats. They weren't prepared for someone with Gary's particular skill set. On the 3rd night, Gary moved closer. Using night vision equipment, He mapped the interior layout of the guard shack and identified the power source for their surveillance system. More importantly, he located Nathan. His son was being held in a modified shipping container 50 yards inside the mine entrance. The boy was alive, but clearly drugged to keep him compliant. Gary watched through a telephoto lens as one of the guards checked on Nathan, confirming what he'd already suspected. They were keeping the child sedated with regular injections. The sight of Nathan, small, helpless, trapped in that metal box, awakened something primal in Gary's chest. But he forced himself to remain calm, to think tactically. Rushing in would only get them both killed. Instead, he began to hunt. The guards worked in pairs, rotating every 8 hours. They were professionals, but they'd grown complacent after months of routine. Gary identified their patterns, their blind spots, their individual weaknesses. The first one died on a Thursday night. Gary caught him during a perimeter check, using a knife to ensure silence. The body disappeared into a ravine 3 miles away, arranged to look like an accidental fall. The other guards assumed their partner had simply abandoned his post, not unusual in their line of work. The second guard vanished 2 nights later while driving to town for supplies. Gary disabled his vehicle, then eliminated the threat before disposing of both body and truck in an old quarry. Again, it looked like the man had simply decided the job wasn't worth the risk. By Monday, the remaining 2 guards were nervous but not panicked. They increased security protocols, started checking in more frequently, but they still didn't understand what they were facing. Gary used their paranoia against them. He began a psychological campaign, small things at first, equipment that moved overnight, footprints that appeared and disappeared, sounds in the darkness that could have been wind but weren't. The third guard cracked first. Gary found him in his car at dawn, engine running, suitcase in the back seat. A single suppressed shot through the driver's window, and the problem was solved. The body joined the others in the quarry. The last guard was tougher, more experienced. He'd served in Iraq, recognized the signs of a professional operation. Instead of running, he called for backup. That was exactly what Gary had been waiting for. Sheriff Vernon Jensen arrived at the mine with 3 deputies and Jack Durham at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Gary watched from the ridgeline as they swept the area, finding no trace of their missing security team. Jensen was shouting orders, Durham was demanding answers, and the deputies were clearly out of their depth. Where the hell is everyone? Jensen demanded. The surviving guard, a man named Chuck O'Connor, was pale but steady. Someone's hunting us, Sheriff. This ain't random. Whoever it is knows what they're doing. It's him, Jack said, his voice tight with fear. It's got to be Claude. Somehow he got out. Jensen shook his head. Impossible. My contact at the base confirms he's still in Iraq. This is something else. Gary smiled in the darkness. Let them think whatever they wanted. Fear made people make mistakes, and he needed them to make a very big mistake. He was about to give them the opportunity. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. Gary's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would make them come to him, on ground of his choosing, where their numbers would work against them. But first, he needed to secure Nathan. The attack came at dawn, when the guards' attention was focused on the perimeter. Gary approached from the mine entrance, using the abandoned tunnels to bypass their surveillance entirely. He'd spent years learning to move through hostile territory without detection. A played-out mine shaft presented no challenge at all. Nathan was unconscious when Gary reached the container, small and fragile in the dim light. Gary's hands were gentle as he checked his son's pulse, pupils, breathing. The boy was drugged but stable. Gary injected him with a mild stimulant to counteract the sedatives, then lifted him carefully. Daddy. Nathan's voice was weak, confused. I'm here, son. Everything's going to be okay now. Gary carried Nathan through the mine tunnels to a secondary exit he'd scouted earlier. His truck was waiting, hidden in a grove of trees 2 miles from the main road. Within 20 minutes, Nathan was secure in a hotel room 60 miles away, being cared for by a military nurse Gary had contacted through encrypted channels. Stay with him, Gary told the nurse, pressing a satellite phone into her hands. If you don't hear from me in 48 hours, call this number. Colonel Downey will take care of everything. By the time Jensen's people discovered Nathan was missing, Gary was already in position for the final phase. He'd chosen the abandoned lumber mill on the outskirts of Pine Ridge as his killing ground. The facility had been closed for 15 years, its buildings slowly surrendering to weather and neglect. More importantly, it was isolated, with multiple entry points and plenty of cover for a man who knew how to use it. Gary's message to Jensen was delivered through the sheriff's own dispatch system, hacked with military-grade software. You want Claude George? Come to Miller's Lumber Mill. Come alone, and we'll discuss terms. Bring backup, and I start sending pieces of your nephew to the FBI. Of course, Jensen would bring backup. Men like him always did. Gary was counting on it. They arrived at sunset, Jensen, Durham, and 8 hired guns from out of state. Professional mercenaries, judging by their equipment and movement patterns. Gary watched them deploy through night vision scopes, noting their positions, their fields of fire, their likely retreat routes. They were good, but they were hunting a ghost. Gary's campaign began with the perimeter guards. 2 men died within the first hour, their bodies discovered only when they failed to check in. The mercenaries tightened their formation, becoming more cautious, which was exactly what Gary wanted. Fear was his greatest weapon now. The 3rd man died to a sniper shot from 300 yards, the bullet fired from a position the mercs had cleared 20 minutes earlier. By the time they reached the shooting position, Gary was gone, already setting up his next ambush. This is insane, one of the mercenaries radioed. We're hunting a fucking ghost out here. He's just one man. Jensen's voice crackled back. Find him and finish this. But Gary wasn't just one man anymore. He was every enemy these mercenaries had ever faced, every nightmare that stalked them through dark places. He was death itself, methodical and implacable. The 4th mercenary tried to flank Gary's last known position and walked into a tripwire connected to a claymore mine. The explosion lit up the night sky and sent the remaining attackers scrambling for cover. Fall back, Jensen ordered. We regroup and wait for daylight. But Gary had no intention of letting them escape. As they retreated toward their vehicles, he triggered the charges he'd placed earlier. Their cars erupted in flames, cutting off their escape route. Now they were trapped in his domain, and Gary began to close the net. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. By midnight, only Jensen, Durham, and 2 mercenaries remained alive. They'd barricaded themselves in the mill's main office, a concrete block building with reinforced doors and few windows. It was a defensible position, but also a trap. Gary let them wait. He knew fear would do more damage than bullets at this point. Every shadow could hide death. Every sound could herald their destruction. He moved through the complex like a specter, occasionally revealing himself just long enough to take a shot, then vanishing before they could return fire. Claude, Jensen finally called out, his voice echoing through the empty mill. We need to talk. Gary's response came from a different direction entirely, his voice amplified by equipment he'd positioned throughout the complex. I'm listening. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. We can make a deal. The way you made a deal with my wife? The way you made a deal with my son? There was a long pause. You don't understand the situation, Claude. This operation goes all the way to Washington. You kill us, and they'll just send someone else. Your son will never be safe. Gary's laugh was cold, mechanical. Let me worry about Washington. Right now, I'm more interested in you. What do you want? I want Helen. I want Jack. And I want you to confess to every family you've destroyed, every soldier you've compromised, every child you've threatened. And if we do that, then I'll kill you quickly. Durham's voice cracked as he screamed into the darkness. You're insane. You think you can just murder half the town and walk away? I don't think, Gary replied. I know. The psychological pressure was working. Gary could hear them arguing inside the office, voices raised in desperation and recrimination. He activated the recording equipment he'd planted earlier, capturing every word for the evidence files he would eventually deliver to Colonel Downey. At 3 a.m., one of the mercenaries cracked. He made a break for the tree line, probably hoping to escape on foot. Gary let him run 50 yards before putting a bullet through his spine. The man's screams echoed through the night until Gary put him out of his misery. One left, Gary announced to the remaining defenders. The last mercenary lasted until dawn. When the sun rose, Gary heard the man arguing with Jensen, demanding payment for a job that had turned into a suicide mission. The argument ended with gunshots. Apparently Jensen had decided to cut his losses. Now only Jensen and Durham remained. Gary approached the office building as the morning light filtered through the broken windows of the mill. He moved openly now, making no attempt at concealment. The time for stealth was over. Come out, he called. Both of you. hands visible. The door opened slowly. Jensen emerged first, his sheriff's uniform torn and stained, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. Durham followed, his earlier arrogance replaced by desperate terror. "Where is she?" Gary asked. "Who?" "Helen. My wife. The woman who helped you destroy my family." Jensen's eyes darted toward the woods. She's not here. We left her in town." Gary studied the man's face with the cold attention he'd once reserved for enemy combatants. "You're lying." "I'm not. I swear to God, Claude, she's back in Pine Ridge. At the house." Gary raised his sidearm, a Sig Sauer that had served him faithfully through a dozen missions. "Last chance. Where's Helen?" Durham broke first. "She's at the safe house. The cabin on Deer Creek Road. Please, man, don't kill us. We were just following orders." "Whose orders?" "Senator Morrison. He's running the whole operation. We're just small-time players." Gary nodded slowly. He'd suspected the operation reached into Washington, but having confirmation was useful. "Thank you for being honest." He shot Durham first, a clean headshot that dropped the man instantly. Jensen tried to run, but Gary's second shot caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling to the ground. "Please," Jensen begged. "I've got kids. Grandkids. So did the families you destroyed." Gary stood over the sheriff, his weapon aimed at the man's head. "Any last words?" "Go to hell. After you." The gunshot echoed through the abandoned mill like the closing of a book. Chapter 8. The Final Betrayal. Deer Creek Road wound through dense forest 20 miles west of Pine Ridge, ending at a hunting cabin that had been in Jensen's family for 3 generations. Gary approached on foot, using the surrounding wilderness to mask his advance. The cabin was larger than he'd expected, more compound than rustic retreat. Security cameras covered the approaches, and he counted at least 2 armed guards patrolling the perimeter. More concerning was the black SUV parked near the main building, government plates, federal markings. Gary settled into a concealed position and began surveillance. What he saw through his scope made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the operation. The man talking to Helen on the cabin's front porch wasn't some local criminal. Gary recognized him from classified briefings. Senator William Morrison, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. One of the most powerful men in Washington was personally involved in this operation. More troubling was Helen's demeanor. She wasn't acting like a hostage or even a reluctant participant. She was animated, confident, clearly at ease with the senator. They were discussing something intently, occasionally pointing toward documents spread across a table. Gary activated his long-range listening equipment and tuned into their conversation. "Claude's more dangerous than we anticipated," Morrison was saying. "My sources confirm he eliminated Jensen and his entire team." "That's what he does," Helen replied, her voice carrying a pride that made Gary's stomach turn. "You wanted the best, Senator. You got him. The question now is control. Can you still manage him?" Helen's laugh was musical, the same laugh that had once made Gary believe in happiness. "Oh, I can manage him. Claude thinks with his heart, not his head. All I have to do is play the victim, tell him I was coerced, threatened. He'll forgive me, he always does. And the boy, Nathan, adores me. He'll back up whatever story I tell. Children are so easy to manipulate." Gary felt something break inside his chest, the last remaining fragment of the man he'd once been. Helen wasn't a victim in this conspiracy. She was the architect. "There is one complication," Morrison said. "My intelligence contacts have gone dark. I think Claude may have eliminated them as well." "He's thorough," Helen agreed. "But he's also predictable. He'll come here looking for me, expecting to find me bound and helpless. When he does, your people will be waiting. And if he doesn't fall for it?" Helen's smile was cold, calculating. "Then I'll give him what he wants most, the truth about his son." Gary's blood turned to ice. "What truth?" "Nathan isn't his biological child. The boy belongs to my previous assignment, another soldier we eliminated 2 years ago. Claude's been raising another man's child, never knowing the difference." Morrison nodded approvingly. "You really are your father's daughter, Helen. He'd be proud of how you turned out. Daddy taught me well. Trust no one, use everyone, and always have an exit strategy." Gary lowered his scope, his mind reeling. Helen's father, the man Gary had never met, supposedly dead since Helen was a teenager, was alive and apparently involved in this conspiracy. The victim's advocate job, the chance meeting at the military event, even Nathan's birth, All of it had been orchestrated. But there was something else, something that cut deeper than the revelation about Nathan's parentage. Gary realized he didn't care. Biological or not, Nathan was his son in every way that mattered. The conspiracy, the betrayal, the years of lies, none of it changed what he felt for the boy. Helen had underestimated him one final time. She thought he would break when he learned the truth. Instead, it only hardened his resolve. Gary began to plan their deaths. Chapter 9, The Last Sunrise. Gary's assault on the cabin began at 4 a.m. during the guard's shift change. He moved through the darkness like death itself, eliminating the perimeter security with the cold efficiency of a man who had made peace with what he was about to do. The federal agents inside were professionals, but they were used to dealing with ordinary criminals, not military special operators. Gary breached the building through 3 different entry points simultaneously, using flashbangs and smoke grenades to create chaos and confusion. The firefight lasted exactly 90 seconds. When the smoke cleared, Gary stood alone among the bodies, his weapon trained on the cabin's main room where Helen and Senator Morrison waited. "Hello, Claude," Helen said, her voice steady despite the carnage around her. She was sitting calmly at the kitchen table, hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for tea service. "I was wondering when you'd get here." Morrison was less composed, his face pale with shock and fear. "You don't know what you're dealing with, soldier. I have resources, connections. Kill me, and you'll have the entire federal government hunting you." Gary ignored the senator, his attention focused entirely on Helen. "How long? How long what? How long have you been planning this? How long have you been lying to me?" Helen's smile was sad, almost regretful. "Since the beginning, Claude. From the very first day we met." "Nathan, not yours. But you already knew that, didn't you? You've been listening." Gary nodded slowly. "I want you to understand something, Helen. I don't care. Nathan is my son regardless of genetics. You used him to hurt me, and for that, you're going to die." "I know." Helen's composure was remarkable, even admirable in its way. "I always knew it would end like this. Daddy prepared me for the possibility. Your father's alive." "Very much so. He's probably watching us right now, actually." Helen gestured toward a small camera mounted in the corner of the room. "Hello, Daddy. I hope I've made you proud." Gary shot the camera without looking, the bullet destroying it in a shower of sparks. "Just you and me now, Helen. No last words for the senator?" Gary turned his attention to Morrison for the first time since entering the room. The man was sweating profusely, his hands shaking as he reached for his cell phone. "Don't," Gary said quietly. Morrison froze. "You can't kill a United States senator. Even you aren't that crazy. Watch me." The bullet took Morrison's center mass, dropping him to the floor where he writhed in agony, but didn't die immediately. Gary had chosen his shot carefully. "Impressive," Helen said, seemingly unbothered by the senator's suffering. "You always were precise." "Stand up." Helen rose gracefully, moving to the window that overlooked Deer Creek. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "It really is beautiful out here. I can see why your people chose this place." "My people?" "The military, the government, everyone who's been using you for the past 8 years. Helen turned to face him, her expression almost pitying. "You still don't understand, do you? This operation, everything that's happened, it was all designed to test you. To see how far you'd go, how much damage you could do when properly motivated." Gary felt the world tilt slightly. "What are you talking about?" Claude George was never meant to disappear forever. The brass wanted to know what would happen if their best asset went rogue, became a domestic threat. So they created a scenario to find out. Helen gestured around the cabin, at Morrison's dying form, at the carnage Gary had left in his wake. "Congratulations. You passed with flying colors." "You're lying." "Am I?" "Think about it, Claude. How convenient was it that Jensen knew your real identity? How easily did you track down this location? How perfectly did everything fall into place to bring you here?" Helen's smile was triumphant. "You've been dancing to their tune from the very beginning." Gary raised his weapon, but Helen held up a hand. "Before you pull that trigger, consider this. Nathan is safe, regardless of what happens here. He'll be taken care of, given a new identity, raised by people who actually care about him. You can walk away right now, disappear into the wilderness, live whatever life you want. Or you can kill me and confirm everything they believe about you, which is that you're a monster who can't be controlled." That Claude George needs to be permanently eliminated. Gary studied Helen's face, looking for any sign of deception. What he saw was worse than lies. He saw the truth. She was right. This had all been orchestrated, an elaborate test designed to measure his capabilities and his limits. But there was one thing Helen hadn't counted on. Gary smiled for the first time in weeks. You're right. I am a monster. But I'm a monster who loves his son more than he fears the consequences. The bullet caught Helen between the eyes, dropping her instantly to the cabin floor. Gary stood over her body for a moment, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness where his heart used to be. Behind him, Senator Morrison made a wet, gasping sound. Gary turned and put a second bullet in the man's head, ending his suffering. Then Gary Sexton walked out of the cabin and disappeared into the Colorado wilderness, leaving behind a trail of bodies and a government conspiracy that would take years to fully unravel. Miles away, in a secure hotel room, Nathan Sexton woke from his drugged sleep to find a new identity waiting for him, along with a letter from the father who loved him enough to become the villain in someone else's story. The sun rose on Pine Ridge for the last time, painting the world in shades of blood and gold. And somewhere in the mountains, a ghost named Claude George began the long work of learning how to be human again. Epilogue, 15 years later. The Hunter's Rest. The cabin sat on 40 acres of wilderness in northern Montana, 3 hours from the nearest town and a lifetime away from civilization. No roads led to it directly. The only access was a hiking trail that wound through dense forest and across 2 streams. To anyone who might stumble upon it, the place looked like any other hunting retreat: weathered logs, solar panels, a small generator shed, and the kind of isolation that spoke of a man who valued his privacy. Claude George had been dead for 15 years now. The official records showed he'd died in a training accident at a classified facility, his body cremated due to security protocols. Even his former handler, Colonel Downey, believed the lie. As far as the world was concerned, the Marine Corps' most dangerous operative had simply ceased to exist. The man who lived in the Montana cabin went by Daniel Cross now, a name supported by documentation so perfect it had been created by the same intelligence networks he'd once served. Daniel was a retired park ranger, a veteran who'd earned his solitude through faithful service and old injuries. He kept to himself, traded for supplies with trappers and hunters, and lived off the grid in a way that attracted no attention from authorities. But Daniel Cross was a careful fiction. The man inside the cabin was still Claude George, and Claude George never stopped being a weapon. Every morning at 0500, he ran a 5-mile perimeter around his property, checking for signs of intrusion. Every evening, he monitored encrypted communications channels, listening for any indication that his enemies had found him. His cabin looked rustic from the outside, but the basement contained enough firepower to outfit a small army and surveillance equipment that could track movement for miles in every direction. For 15 years, he'd lived with the knowledge that someday, someone would come for him. The government conspiracy he'd exposed went deeper than a single senator and a corrupt sheriff. There were people in Washington who knew the truth about Claude George, who understood exactly what he was capable of, and who would never rest easy knowing he was still alive. Let them come, he thought as he cleaned his weapons each night. He'd spent 15 years preparing for that day, but no one came. The years passed quietly, marked only by the changing seasons and the slow accumulation of gray in his hair. By his 50th birthday, Claude began to wonder if perhaps they'd decided he was more dangerous to hunt than to ignore. Then, on a Tuesday in October, exactly 15 years after the events in Pine Ridge, everything changed. The letter. The message came through a dead drop Claude had maintained for over a decade, a hollow tree stump 10 miles from his cabin that he checked monthly out of habit more than expectation. The envelope was unmarked, sealed with wax, and contained a single photograph and a handwritten letter. The photograph showed a young man in military dress uniform, his posture straight and proud, his dark eyes familiar in a way that made Claude's chest tighten. The face was older, harder, marked by experiences Claude couldn't imagine, but there was no mistaking those features. Nathan, his son, now 21 years old and a commissioned officer in the United States Army. The letter was brief, written in careful block letters. Claude, I know who you are. I know what you did. I know why you did it. I also know you've been watching from a distance, making sure I was safe. The scholarship to West Point didn't come from the Army. It came from an anonymous trust fund that's been paying my expenses since I was 7 years old. The accidents that befell anyone who showed too much interest in my background weren't coincidences. Thank you for protecting me. Thank you for loving me enough to become the monster they said you were. I'm stationed at Fort Carson now, 6 hours from your location. I'd like to meet. There are things I need to say and questions I need answered. If you're willing, come to the Overlook Trail in Rocky Mountain National Park this Saturday at noon. Come alone. I'll do the same. Your son, Lieutenant Nathan Cross. Claude read the letter 3 times before setting it aside. Nathan had taken the Cross surname, the identity Claude had created for him all those years ago. More than that, the boy had figured out who his father really was and where he was hiding. The smart play was to ignore the letter. Contact meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Claude had survived 15 years by trusting no one and maintaining absolute operational security. Meeting Nathan would violate every principle that had kept him alive. But as Claude looked at the photograph again, he realized he'd already made his decision. Nathan was right. Claude had been watching from a distance, using old contacts and carefully placed resources to ensure his son's safety. The scholarship, the protection, the elimination of threats, all of it had been Claude's work, conducted through intermediaries and cutouts to maintain his cover. Now Nathan was a man, a soldier, someone who might understand the choices Claude had made. For the first time in 15 years, Claude felt something other than the cold satisfaction of survival. He felt hope. The reckoning. Rocky Mountain National Park was crowded on a Saturday in October, filled with families enjoying the fall foliage and hikers taking advantage of the perfect weather. Claude arrived 2 hours early, positioning himself on a ridge where he could observe the meeting site through binoculars. Nathan was already there, standing at the edge of the overlook with the confidence of someone completely at ease in the wilderness. He was taller than Claude had expected, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of career soldiers. More importantly, he was alone, just as he'd promised. But Claude hadn't survived 15 years by taking anyone at their word. He spent an hour scanning the area for surveillance teams, sniper positions, or any sign that this was a trap. When he was satisfied that Nathan had come alone, Claude began his approach. The young man turned as Claude emerged from the tree line, and for a moment, father and son simply stared at each other across 15 years of separation and silence. "You're older than I expected," Nathan said finally. "You're exactly what I hoped you'd become," Claude replied. They stood together at the overlook, 2 soldiers separated by a generation and united by bonds that ran deeper than blood. Below them, the Colorado wilderness stretched to the horizon, beautiful and unforgiving in the way that had shaped both their lives. "I have questions," Nathan said. "I have answers. Most of them, anyway. Was any of it real? The marriage, the family, the house in Pine Ridge?" Claude considered the question carefully. "My love for you was real. Everything else was a lie, but that part was true from the moment I first held you. Even knowing I wasn't your biological son, especially knowing that. DNA doesn't make a father, Nathan. Choice does. And I chose you every day for 7 years." Nathan nodded, accepting the answer. "What happened to her?" "To Helen. I killed her, along with everyone else involved in the conspiracy. Do you regret it?" Claude met his son's eyes, seeing no judgment there, only curiosity. "No. They used you to control me, threatened to hurt you to make me compliant. That was unforgivable. The government buried the whole thing. Officially, Senator Morrison died in a car accident. Sheriff Jensen had a heart attack. The others just disappeared from the records. They couldn't afford to let the truth come out. Too many operations would have been compromised. Too many families would have demanded answers." Claude paused. "How did you find out?" Nathan smiled, and for a moment, Claude saw the boy he'd once been. "I'm my father's son. I know how to dig for information, how to piece together puzzles that people want to keep hidden. It took me years, but eventually I found the truth." "And what will you do with it?" "Nothing. The people responsible are dead, the operation was dismantled, and you're finally free. What would be the point of revenge against an enemy that no longer exists?" Claude felt a weight he'd carried for 15 years finally begin to lift. "You could have turned me in, collected the bounty they probably still have on my head. Is that what you think of me? I think you're a better man than I ever was." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, watching clouds drift across the mountain peaks. "I enlisted because of you. Because I wanted to understand what kind of man could do what you did. What I found was a system that chews people up and spits them out, that creates monsters and then acts surprised when those monsters turn on their creators. I never wanted that life for you. I know, but it's the life I chose. The difference is, I went in with my eyes open. I know what I am, what I'm capable of, and I've made peace with it. Nathan turned to face his father. The question is, have you? Claude thought about the question, about the 15 years of isolation and vigilance, about the man he'd become and the prices he'd paid. I don't know. Sometimes I think I'm exactly what they made me. Other times, I remember holding you as a baby and think maybe there's still something human left inside. There is. Otherwise, you wouldn't have spent 15 years protecting someone who isn't even your blood. You are my blood, Nathan. In every way that matters. I know. And that's why I'm here. Nathan reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. I have something for you. Inside the envelope were documents, official military records, death certificates, case files. Claude recognized them immediately as the classified files related to the Pine Ridge operation. These are the last existing copies, Nathan explained. Everything else has been destroyed or buried so deep it might as well not exist. Officially, Claude George died 15 years ago in a training accident. Unofficially, the people who might remember differently are either dead or have much bigger problems to worry about. Claude stared at the documents, hardly daring to believe what Nathan was telling him. You're saying I'm free? I'm saying the ghost can finally rest. Daniel Cross can live whatever life he wants, and no one will come looking for Claude George because Claude George doesn't exist anymore. How? Nathan's smile was sharp, predatory in a way that reminded Claude exactly whose son he was. I told you, I'm my father's son. I learned from the best. It took me 3 years to track down every person who knew the truth, every file that contained evidence, every loose end that could unravel your new life. Some problems I solved with paperwork. Others required more direct intervention. Claude felt a chill run down his spine. What did you do? What needed to be done? What you taught me to do. Nathan's voice was calm, matter of fact. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Dad. You made sure I would survive in a world full of monsters by teaching me to be one when necessary. For the first time in 15 years, Claude felt something like fear. Not for himself, but for what he'd inadvertently created. Nathan, tell me you haven't. Haven't what? Killed in the name of protecting someone I love? Haven't used every skill and resource at my disposal to eliminate threats to my family? Nathan's laugh was cold. I'm exactly what you made me, Dad. The difference is, I chose to use those skills to set you free instead of destroying everything around me. Claude stared at his son, seeing himself reflected in those dark eyes. The boy he'd tried to protect had grown into a man capable of the same ruthless calculations that had defined Claude's life. It should have horrified him. Instead, he felt a twisted kind of pride. What happens now? Claude asked. Now you choose. You can stay in your cabin, live as a hermit for the rest of your life, and die alone with your ghosts. Or you can come home. Home? I bought a ranch in Wyoming. 2,000 acres, completely isolated, defensible terrain. Big enough for both of us to live without getting in each other's way. Nathan paused. I could use a partner. Someone who understands the work I do, who can watch my back when things get complicated. Claude looked at his son, a man now, a soldier, a killer in his own right, and realized that everything he'd done, every choice he'd made, had led to this moment. The boy he'd saved had grown up to save him in return. What kind of work? Claude asked. Nathan's smile was sharp as a blade. The kind that needs doing. There are still monsters in the world, Dad. Still people who prey on the innocent, who hide behind power and position to escape justice. The government might have abandoned its responsibility to deal with them, but that doesn't mean they should go unpunished. Vigilante justice. Justice, period. The law failed us once. It fails a lot of people. Sometimes you need wolves to hunt wolves. Claude thought about the offer, about the chance to work alongside his son, to use his skills for something other than mere survival. It was dangerous, probably illegal, certainly outside the bounds of civilized society. It was also exactly what he'd been born to do. All right, he said finally. Let's go home. The ranch. The Cross Ranch sat in a valley between two mountain ranges, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through miles of wilderness. The main house was built like a fortress, stone walls, bulletproof windows, multiple escape routes. The outbuildings included a workshop, a training facility, and what Nathan euphemistically called the guest quarters, a secure facility designed to hold prisoners for interrogation. Claude had been living there for 6 months when their first job came in. The client was a woman named Sarah Manning, whose daughter had been kidnapped by a human trafficking ring with connections to several prominent politicians. The FBI was investigating, but their progress was being hampered by political pressure and jurisdictional complications. Sarah had exhausted legal options and was desperate enough to seek help from the shadows. The lead trafficker is a man named Vincent Riley, Nathan explained as they reviewed the case files. He's got protection at the highest levels: judges, senators, law enforcement officials who've been bought or blackmailed into cooperation. Officially, he's a successful businessman. Unofficially, he's responsible for the disappearance of at least 30 young women over the past 5 years. Claude studied Riley's photograph, memorizing the face. And the girl, Emma Manning, 16 years old, honor student, disappeared 3 weeks ago after leaving her job at a local diner. Local police classified it as a runaway case and stopped investigating after 48 hours. But you know better. I know Riley's operation. I've been tracking it for 2 years, waiting for the right opportunity to move. This gives us everything we need: moral justification, political cover, and a client who can never testify against us because officially, we don't exist. Claude nodded approvingly. Nathan had learned the lessons well. Always have justification, always have protection, always have deniability. What's the plan? Simple and direct. We locate the girl, extract her, and eliminate everyone involved in the operation. No trials, no plea bargains, no chance for them to buy their way out of consequences. And Riley? Nathan's smile was cold. Riley dies last, after he's told us everything about his network, his clients, and his protection. Then we burn the whole operation to the ground. The mission took 2 weeks to plan and 3 days to execute. By the time it was over, Emma Manning was safely home with her mother. Vincent Riley and 17 of his associates were dead, and a human trafficking network that had operated for over a decade had been completely dismantled. The authorities found the bodies arranged in a warehouse outside Denver, along with detailed evidence of their crimes and a list of their victims. The media called it a gang war. Law enforcement called it a mystery. Sarah Manning called it a miracle. Claude called it justice. The legacy. 5 years passed. The Cross Ranch became the unofficial headquarters for a network of operators who specialized in cases the system couldn't or wouldn't handle. Child predators, corrupt officials, international criminals who hid behind diplomatic immunity. They all learned to fear the shadows where Claude and Nathan worked. They never advertised their services. Clients found them through word of mouth. Desperate people who had exhausted legal options and needed someone willing to operate outside the boundaries of civilized society. Payment was rarely monetary. More often, it was simply the satisfaction of seeing justice served and innocent people protected. Claude had found peace in the work, a sense of purpose that had been missing since the day he'd walked out of that cabin in Colorado. He was still a killer, still a weapon, but now he was a weapon wielded in service of something greater than his own survival. Nathan proved to be everything Claude could have hoped for in a partner. The boy had inherited his father's tactical brilliance and capacity for violence, but he'd also developed something Claude had never possessed: the ability to see the bigger picture, to understand that every action had consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate target. "We're not just killing bad people," Nathan explained during one of their planning sessions. "We're creating a reputation, building a myth. Every predator we eliminate, every corrupt official we expose, every trafficking ring we destroy, it sends a message to others like them. They know we're out here now, and that knowledge makes them afraid." Fear is a weapon, Claude agreed. The most effective weapon. When monsters start looking over their shoulders, when they can't sleep at night because they know someone might be coming for them, that's when we've really won. On Claude's 55th birthday, Nathan presented him with a gift: a leather-bound journal containing detailed records of every operation they'd conducted together. 37 missions over 5 years. 143 lives ended. Countless innocents saved. "Our legacy," Nathan said simply. Claude flipped through the pages, reading accounts of missions that had taken them from urban nightmares to international conspiracies. Each entry was meticulously documented, complete with photographs, evidence, and outcomes. It read like the case files of some mythical vigilante organization. Why? Claude asked. Because someday, when we're gone, someone else will need to carry on the work. This journal will be their guide, their instruction manual. Our experience will become their foundation. Claude nodded, understanding. They weren't just father and son anymore. They were the beginning of something larger, a legacy that would outlive them both. The end of the hunt. Claude George died quietly in his sleep on a winter morning in his 60th year. Nathan found him in his chair on the ranch house porch, facing the mountains, looking peaceful for the first time in decades. There was no violence, no final confrontation with enemies from his past. The most dangerous man alive simply closed his eyes and let go. Nathan buried his father in an unmarked grave on a hill overlooking the valley, with a simple stone marker that read, Daniel Cross, Father, Soldier, Protector. The service was attended by one person, Nathan himself, but the death was mourned by dozens of people whose lives had been saved by Claude's work. A week after the funeral, Nathan received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a young woman in military uniform, standing at attention with the same dark eyes and stubborn jaw that marked her as family. The note was brief. Emma Manning, Lieutenant, United States Army. Reporting for duty. What would my grandfather want me to do? Nathan smiled as he read the message. Claude's legacy would continue after all, carried forward by the girl they'd saved years ago, who had grown up to become exactly what her grandfather would have wanted, a protector of the innocent and a hunter of monsters. The ranch in Wyoming remained operational, its work continuing under new management. The Cross name became whispered legend in certain circles, a family of ghosts who appeared when evil seemed unstoppable, who delivered justice when the system failed, who reminded the worst of humanity that somewhere in the darkness, someone was always watching. And in a grave on a hill in Wyoming, Claude George finally rested in peace, knowing that the boy he'd loved enough to become a monster for had grown into a man capable of carrying on the hunt. The ghost was gone, but the work would never end. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.